Welcome to this in-depth look at the M-Audio Oxygen series MIDI controllers. They're a marvellous budget-level control surface for all genres of music production, and if you own one, this video is intended to help you really unlock its potential. You're probably aware that your Oxygen has all kinds of functionality which you never use, but the labels across the top of the keybed look pretty intimidating and technical, and it's hard to know whether you even need that stuff anyway. The good news is that the advanced features turn out to be pretty easy once you know how they work. And when you do customise your Oxygen to suit the particular software or hardware you're using, it can help to make your workflow less frustrating and more fun. Mastering the Oxygen can also spark lots of exciting ideas about new ways to use its various controls, and hopefully explore some new musical directions. There's a lot of ground to cover, so let's get started. Before we dive into the technical wizardry, let's make sure that we know the basics. I'm going to talk about MIDI messages a lot, so just keep in mind that MIDI data gets sent from the Oxygen controller to the computer, but no data of any kind goes back the other way, which means that the Oxygen is always blissfully unaware of anything which might be happening on the computer, with the possible exception of the power supply bursting into flames. Now, let's take a quick introductory tour of the different regions of the controller. First up is the keybed, which is as simple as you'd expect. The keys just send MIDI note on and note off messages across whichever MIDI channel you've set. As I'm sure you know, note on and note off messages include the pitch of the note being played and the velocity. You can shift the pitch of the keys up or down by an octave using the plus and minus keys, and you have a little bit of control over the velocity response of the keys, which we'll look at shortly. But apart from that, there's no customization for the keybed. So if you want to do something fancy, like splitting the keyboard into two different instruments, you'll need to manage that on the computer. It's also important to understand that the white piano keys are used for data entry when you put the Oxygen into edit mode. That's what those labels across the top of the keys are all about, and the main purpose of this video is to get you to the point where you're confidently using edit mode. The drum pads are also quite simple. Technically, you should think of them as a second mini keyboard, because they operate just like a second keybed, but with even less customizability. Just like the piano keys, they send MIDI note on and note off messages, with a velocity ranging from 1 to 127, and you can shift the note pitches up and down. But the drum pads will always use MIDI channel 10 without exception, and unlike the piano keys, you can't adjust their velocity response at all. If all this makes them sound a bit limited, well, yeah, I feel the same way. I'll show you some other uses for them before we're done, but for now I just want to point out that the drum pads have nothing in common with the controllers on the Oxygen, that is, the knobs, sliders and buttons, because they can't do any of the things which the controllers can do. Speaking of which, the controllers are used to send various types of MIDI messages. They're all labelled with a C and a number, so we have the sliders, the knobs, various buttons, the pitch wheel, the mod wheel, and don't forget the jack on the back for a sustain pedal. As I mentioned, the drum pads are not controllers, nor are the piano keys, or these buttons on the left. First up, these labels have nothing to do with the MIDI messages being sent. They're just labelled to help identify which is which. The C means it's a controller, it has nothing to do with MIDI CC messages, and the number is arbitrary. I should also point out that despite the physical differences between the sliders, wheels, foot pedals and so on, all the controllers are equal citizens in terms of what they can and can't do. You can configure any of the controls to send just about any kind of MIDI message you want. Whenever you adjust one of the controls, such as a knob or slider, the LED screen gives you a couple of pieces of feedback. While the control is being moved, you can see the value of the MIDI message you're sending, which is generally a number from 0 to 127. It corresponds to the position of the slider or knob, so I usually ignore it since I can already see the position of the control. By the way, you can ignore the red dot on the LED display. It may look like a decimal place, but it's not. We'll see what it's for shortly, but just remember that the LED only displays integers, not decimals. Anyway, when you stop adjusting the control and wait for 1 second, the screen will display a second piece of information, which I'm going to call the function number, because it tells you the function of the control, in other words, what kind of MIDI messages were just sent. M-Audio sometimes calls this the control number, but that seems a bit confusing to me, since these are the control numbers. Of course, we'll be looking at function numbers later in this video, but in a nutshell, if the function number is between 0 and 127, then the control is sending ordinary CC messages. For example, if I move the mod wheel to the top, I can see that the value goes up to 127, in other words the maximum, and the function number is 1, which tells me that the mod wheel is sending CC1 messages, which is good because CC1 is the standard convention for mod wheel messages. If you get a function number above 127, then the control isn't sending an ordinary CC message, or at least not in an ordinary way, in which case you'll need to refer to the appendix of your Oxygen manual to see what the function number means. The pitch bend wheel and the buttons beneath the sliders usually fall into this category. We'll come back to these topics later, but first we need to finish covering the basics. One of the first things you'll want to learn is how to use these labels below the LED screen: Global, Program and Preset. Pressing the Select button will cycle between these three settings, and the red dot on the screen tells you which one is active. The left and right buttons will decrease and increase the value of the current setting and flash up the new value for a second. Unfortunately, cycling between the settings won't display their current value, so sometimes you may need to increment then decrement a setting just to see what the current value is. Let's take a closer look at each setting in turn. On the left is the Global MIDI channel, rather cryptically labelled Global. So I'll press the Select button until the red dot is over the Global label, and now I can cycle through the 16 MIDI channels. You'll discover that the values wrap around, and that's the case for all settings and values on the Oxygen. There's also a lowercase c on the left, which is a nice reminder that you're setting the MIDI channel number. Most MIDI messages will be sent on whichever channel you set here. It's a good idea to remain consistent, or at least mindful of which channel you're sending, and I use channel 1 most of the time. In FL Studio, for example, links are always channel specific, so being on the wrong MIDI channel can trip you up. The next label is PGM, which is short for Program. When you increment or decrement this value, the controller sends a MIDI message called a program change message, which can be interpreted in different ways depending on what receives the message. In most instruments and effects processors, whether hardware or software, a program, also called a patch, a snapshot, or a preset, is just a collection of all the settings which define the sound. For example, if I open Massive in standalone mode, create a program list, and toggle on Program Control, then I can use program change messages from the Oxygen to step between those presets. In contrast, if you send a program change message to your DAW, it may behave differently. FL Studio, for example, will use program change messages to set the current channel in the channel rack. In practice, there are a number of reasons why sending program change messages from the Oxygen may be less useful than you'd expect. For example, you should keep in mind that the Oxygen controller uses its own internal counter to keep track of the current program number. So, if I use the mouse to activate channel 1 in FL Studio, then increment the program number on the Oxygen, FL Studio will jump straight to channel 7 in this case. I should also point out that of these three modes, MIDI channel, program change and preset number, the program change function is kind of the odd one out because it's the only one which will send MIDI messages to the computer. The other two are just for configuring the Oxygen controller. And since I'm on the topic of program change messages, I should mention that these buttons beneath the sliders will also send program change messages. Of course, they can be configured to do other things, but that's the default behavior. Next, let's take a look at presets. So the various hardware controls, knobs, buttons, wheels and sliders, can be configured to send different kinds of MIDI messages, and we'll learn how to do that shortly. A preset is just a way of storing how all the controls are configured. So it's a kind of snapshot of how all the controls behave. There are 10 presets and you can cycle through them with the arrow buttons. When you change to a new preset, no MIDI messages get sent to the computer. Instead, the behavior of the various hardware controllers will change. To understand presets, it's best to see them in action. The appendix of your Oxygen manual may contain a list of the 10 factory presets. These 10 slots will also be used for storing your own user presets, but let's start by looking at the default factory presets. As you can see, the first 6 presets have been configured to work well with some specific software instruments, such as Twist or Expand. Some of those plugins may have been included with your Oxygen purchase, and the corresponding presets might be helpful if you plan to use them. Otherwise, they're not very useful. Presets 7 through 10, on the other hand, are much better for general purpose MIDI control, or as a starting point for creating your own presets. For example, I'll switch to one of the general MIDI presets, then adjust the pitch wheel. I can see that the function number is 144, and the Oxygen manual tells me that this means it's sending pitch bend messages, which is ideal. Now, I'll switch to preset 3, which is intended for controlling the Velvet electric piano plugin. When I tweak the pitch wheel, I can see that it's sending CC71 messages. That may be fine for the Velvet plugin, but it's not great for other situations. Since I don't use Velvet, preset 3 is a pretty good slot for me to store one of my own presets, which we'll learn how to do later. And that wraps it up for the 3 labels beneath the screen: Global MIDI Channel, Program Change, and Presets. We're almost ready to start customizing some controllers, but before we do, there are just 3 other basic features I should mention. Firstly, if you decide to connect a foot pedal to your Oxygen, you should connect it before you turn on the Oxygen, otherwise pedal down and pedal up will be inverted. You can also check out another video I made about foot pedals, which is linked below. Secondly, I should mention that the Oxygen has an auto button and light, which can be used to toggle on and off a feature called DirectLink. This feature only works with certain DAWs, and it basically maps all the Oxygen controllers to useful controls in your specific DAW, such as mixer controls. So it's a lot like the presets we looked at earlier. You'll need to consult the Oxygen manual to see if your DAW is supported, but if, like me, your DAW isn't supported, you can take heart in the fact that you're not missing out on much. Many of the Oxygen's controllers, such as the transport controls, should work as expected anyway, and most DAWs will make it pretty easy for you to link your Oxygen hardware to useful controls, such as the mixer. Not to mention the fact that you'll have more flexibility when DirectLink is turned off. The final basic feature I should mention is that you can customize the velocity response of the keybed. That is to say, you have a little bit of control over the velocity values of your MIDI notes in relation to how hard you hit the keys. This feature is quite common in many virtual instruments, so you may have come across velocity response curves before, such as this little graph in The Grandeur by Native Instruments. The Oxygen has 7 different sensitivity settings, which are listed in the manual, and if M-Audio liked creating cute little graphs, they might look something like this. I'll start by checking which velocity setting I'm currently using. To do that, I'll press the Edit button to enter edit mode, then I'll press the white piano key, which is labelled Velocity Curve. Right away, it tells me the current value is C2, which is the default setting. There are lots of other settings you can check in the same way, which is pretty handy. Since I don't want to change the value at this point, I'll simply exit edit mode, either by pressing the Edit button again, or by pressing the Cancel key. If you've just bought an Oxygen controller, I think it's worth spending some time getting a feel for the default response, especially if you're inexperienced. But suppose, for the sake of argument, that my hands are made of lead, and even when I try to play softly, it ends up sounding like a herd of elephants stampeding across my keyboard. It might be worth trying out the C1 velocity curve. So I'll go back into edit mode, press the velocity curve key again, but this time I'll change the value from C2 to C1, either by pressing the left-right buttons to increase or decrease the value, or by entering a new value using the numeric keys 0 to 9. Now that I have C01 flashing on the display, I need to press the Enter key over on the right to apply the new value and exit edit mode. If you forget the Enter key, none of the changes you make in edit mode will stick. Of course, it's up to you to decide which velocity setting to use, but in my opinion, it's a good idea for your MIDI controller to produce the widest possible dynamic response, from very soft to very loud, without too much bias towards either end. When you're producing music, it can be very effective to limit the dynamic range of a performance, which is why so many virtual instruments have controls to do just that. But I'd recommend limiting the dynamic range using your software, such as the piano roll or plugin settings, rather than on your Oxygen controller. But that's just my 2 cents worth. And that's it for the basic features of the Oxygen. Really, the only remaining topics to cover are how to customize the behavior of the various controllers and how to store those customizations in your own presets. With those skills under your belt, you'll officially be an Oxygen guru. Let's start by customizing one of the sliders so that it sends a MIDI CC message of our own choosing. This is probably the most common way you'll want to customize the knobs and sliders. I'll switch to Oxygen's preset 10, which is a general MIDI preset and a good starting point for your own customizations. When I tweak the slider on the left, I can see that it's currently sending CC74 messages. I'm going to change the behavior of that slider so that it sends CC69 messages instead. If you're wondering why the hell I'd want to do that, I'll get to that later, but for now, let's get customizing. I'll enter edit mode and start by specifying which control I want to customize. I'll press the Control Select key, then nudge the slider on the left so that the Oxygen knows which control I want to edit. Notice that the LED screen shows that I've selected control number 1, which corresponds to the label above the slider. To change the function of the slider, I'll press the Control Assign key. The display now flashes the function number 74, which tells me that the slider is sending CC74 messages. To change this number to 69, I can either use the arrow buttons, or I can enter a new number using the numeric keys 0 to 9. Now that I've finished changing the function number, I'll press the Enter key to apply my changes. If I'd wanted to discard my changes, I could have pressed the Cancel key instead. Now the slider should be sending CC69 messages, so let's confirm that it's working. Yep, it looks good to me. Of course, you can customize all the other sliders and knobs in exactly the same way. You can also configure the pitch bend and modulation wheels in this way, but personally, I prefer having the wheels always send the expected MIDI messages, namely pitch bend and CC1. It's important to realize that after you've made an edit like this, the change is only stored in the Oxygen's short-term memory. If I switch off the power or change to a different Oxygen preset, then my edits will be lost forever. Short-term storage is a great way to experiment with edit mode, but if you want to keep your changes, you'll need to store them in one of the Oxygen's 10 presets. We'll have a go at doing that shortly, but in this case I don't want to keep my changes, so I'll decrease the preset number to 9, then back up to 10. This effectively reloads preset 10, and if I tweak the slider again, I can see that it's reverted to sending CC74 messages. Now that we've covered customizing knobs and sliders, it seems logical to look at customizing the buttons, but I've decided to leave that topic until the very end of the video as a sort of bonus, because it's a bit more advanced and I don't want anyone's head to explode, including my own, before we get to the finish line. Besides which, we've got more important fish to fry, so instead, let's jump straight into storing presets. Fortunately, this is dead easy. If I've customized some of the controls, I can store the current setup in a preset by entering edit mode, pressing the Store key, selecting the preset number I want to overwrite, and then pressing the Enter key. It's that simple. Now my customizations won't be lost, even if I switch off the Oxygen or unplug it. You can afford to be pretty reckless about overwriting the factory presets, because if you change your mind, you can always restore all the factory presets by holding down both the octave buttons when you turn on the Oxygen. Let's look at an example which combines customizing a knob and storing that in a preset. We'll use CC10 messages. According to the MIDI specification, CC10 messages are commonly used to control panning from left to right, and many instruments, such as Kontakt, will respond to CC10 messages by default. So I'll customize one of the Oxygen's knobs to do just that. Before I start editing any controllers, I want to make sure that I'm starting from a preset which I'm happy with. Remember that when I store my preset, it will store the behavior of all the Oxygen controls. I'll only be customizing a single knob, but I want all the other controls to have useful behavior as well. So I'm going to start by loading preset 10, which is one of the general MIDI presets. Now I'll configure one of the knobs to send CC10 messages. I'll enter edit mode and specify which knob I want to edit. Then I'll change the function number of the knob to 10, so that it sends CC10 messages. And finally, I'll press Enter to apply my changes. My changes are only in short-term memory, but I can still test the new behavior with Kontakt. And it looks good to me. So now I'll store the current configuration in a preset by entering edit mode, pressing the Store button, and choosing which preset number to overwrite. Sometimes you'll want to store changes in the same preset number you started with, and other times you might want to overwrite a completely different preset. As you can imagine, this gives you the freedom to do all sorts of things, such as copy or duplicate presets, move them, make several variations of a preset, and so on. In this case, I'll store my preset in slot 1, which I'm not using, and press the Enter key. And we're done. Just to confirm that it's working, I'll switch back to preset 10 and, as expected, Kontakt doesn't respond because the knob is now sending CC75 messages. And when I change to preset 1, I get the behavior I stored and I can pan my Kontakt instruments. Since we're already looking at Kontakt, I should point out that CC7, or channel volume, is another common MIDI message which Kontakt will respond to by default. It's no coincidence that the Oxygen slider on the right will send CC7 messages. if you load one of the general MIDI presets. So that slider will control the volume of Kontakt and many other software instruments for free. Of course, now you know how to change the behavior of that slider if you want to, but I quite like having it set to CC7. Now let's put some of these concepts into practice and explore some of the ways I might want to customize my Oxygen. The best customizations for you will depend on what software and hardware you use and how you like to produce music, but hopefully these examples may at least give you some ideas. It's pretty common for Kontakt instruments to use key switching to quickly change between different articulations within a single instrument. For example, I'll load the Kontakt factory string ensemble and the default articulation is legato. If I want to switch to staccato without leaving the keyboard, I can just play a D-sharp 0 note. Unfortunately, my Oxygen only has a range of 4 octaves, so I'll need to shift the whole keyboard down an octave, play the lowest D-sharp, then shift back up an octave and continue playing. Not exactly the recipe for a virtuoso performance. But fortunately, the buttons on the Oxygen can be configured to send MIDI note on and note off messages. So I've created an Oxygen preset which will switch between articulations in most of the Kontakt factory libraries. The trick is to use function number 147 to send note on messages, and you'll learn more about configuring the Oxygen's buttons at the end of this video. Now let's take a quick look at the Spitfire Labs plugin. Like most instruments from Spitfire Audio, it offers both an expression slider and a dynamic slider. In some of their videos, the Spitfire lads suggest sliding both of these with your left hand while playing the keybed with your right hand, especially if you want to add emotion and expression to long, slow notes or phrases. Of course, the mod wheel already sends CC1 messages, but if you want to control both sliders with one hand, you'll need to use 2 controls in close proximity, such as the first 2 sliders on the Oxygen. So here's a custom preset I created which sends CC11 and CC1 messages from those sliders. This isn't such a big deal in Labs, but it can be quite useful for Spitfire libraries which run in Kontakt and for other instruments too. If you use the Komplete Kontrol plugin by Native Instruments, then it can be handy to map the 8 knobs on the Oxygen to the 8 knobs at the top of Komplete Kontrol, just like Native Instruments do with their own hardware. I'll open Komplete Kontrol in standalone mode, and on the Oxygen I'll load preset 10. Then I'll use the MIDI learn function to assign each of the 8 knobs. And now I can use the Oxygen to tweak all of my Komplete Kontrol instruments. However, this raises an issue we should look out for. If I go back into MIDI Learn mode, it shows me which MIDI CC messages are associated with each knob, and most of them are general purpose MIDI CC numbers, which is good. But the first knob is mapped to CC10, which raises a bit of a red flag for me. We've already looked at how CC10 messages are commonly used to pan instruments from left to right. If we try to use CC10 messages as a general purpose controller as well, then we might run into some problems. For example, if I load an instrument in Kontakt, I can send it CC10 messages, maybe from some automation, and I can trust that it will control the panning. But if I load the same instrument in Komplete Kontrol, then the same CC10 messages now control something completely different, and I'll have to find some other way of automating the pan slider. Because I use Komplete Kontrol quite often, I've chosen to change the behavior of that knob on my Oxygen to use a different CC number instead. This may seem a little pedantic, but the underlying principle is that there are a handful of MIDI CC messages which are so commonly used for specific functions that you run the risk of headaches or confusion if you use them for other purposes. This issue isn't limited to Komplete Kontrol, by the way. For example, if I open FM8 by Native Instruments and I try using CC64 messages to control this effects knob, then it does work and I can control the knob. But now I have a big problem, which is that CC64 messages are normally used by a sustain pedal. So whenever I turn the knob above halfway, FM8 thinks I'm holding down a sustain pedal and the notes I play get stuck. Fortunately, there aren't very many CC messages which fall into this category, and you'll get familiar with them the more you work with MIDI. The exact list will depend on which hardware and software you use. But here's a list of the MIDI CC messages which I find are the most likely to already have some function in my plugins or my DAW. I'm not suggesting that you avoid these CC messages. On the contrary, you'll often want to seek them out because they can help you get the most out of your software, but it pays to be mindful of their intended function. Before we leave Komplete Kontrol behind, I should mention that you can also configure the buttons on your Oxygen to navigate through presets, plugins, or plugin pages within Komplete Kontrol. Here, I'm using the Oxygen to navigate through the various pages of parameters for the Giant. We'll look at configuring buttons later. Some synths, such as Massive X, are configured to respond to Aftertouch messages. Although the Oxygen Keybed doesn't support Aftertouch, you can configure any of the sliders or knobs to send Aftertouch messages if you want. Of course, it's no substitute for a more expensive MIDI controller with real Aftertouch, but since the sound designers have gone to the trouble of linking Aftertouch messages to all sorts of parameters in sonically interesting ways, it may be worth exploring the effect of Aftertouch on instruments like Massive X. Now let's take a quick look at some of the ways you can use the drum pads. When you map the Oxygen's pads to your favourite drum software, such as Battery, you'll discover that the notes played by the pads aren't consecutive notes as you might expect, but rather they're spread out across more than an octave, seemingly at random. It took me a while to figure out the reasoning behind this, but it turns out to be using notes from the general MIDI specification, so that if you're connected to a general MIDI sound source, you'll get a standard drum kit with a kick, snare, hi-hats and so on. Unfortunately, the intervals between the drum pad notes can't be changed, but you can transpose all the pad notes up or down, much like transposing the Keybed up or down an octave. For example, the lowest pad note is 2 octaves below middle C by default. To transpose all the pads down by an octave, I can hold down the Shift button, then use the octave plus and minus buttons. The first button press won't make any changes, but it will light one of the drum pads to show you which octave you're currently using. Here, I can see that I'm at the default setting. Subsequent button presses will move the lit pad up or down to show you how many octaves you're shifting. To shift it down by an octave, I'll move the light to drum pad number 2. Now all the drum pads play an octave lower than before. It's a shame that the drum pads don't play consecutive notes, because if they did, you could move up or down an octave to access a whole new set of drum sounds. But because the general MIDI notes they've chosen span more than an octave, you'll get some overlapping notes when you transpose by an octave, which means that some of the drum sounds will be the same but assigned to different pads. Not cool. Incidentally, you can also transpose the drum pads in semitones rather than whole octaves by holding down both Shift and Select before using the octave buttons. But to be honest, you run into the same issue with overlapping notes. So if you want to access more than 8 drum sounds in a session, you might want to consider transposing by 2 octaves or just switching between multiple instances of your drum plugin. And of course, a template can help you quickly build a drum kit which responds to the right notes. Personally, I'm not a big fan of the responsiveness of the drum pads, but I've found other uses for them. For example, Tractus 12 by Native Instruments offers some awesome tools for chopping and mangling beats. Here, I've mapped the Oxygen pads to various buttons in Tractus 12, such as slice or mash. If you've used Tractus 12, you know that the various buttons normally operate in toggle mode, which is probably the best approach when you're working with a mouse. But thanks to FL Studio's versatile linking system, I can have the drum pads work as triggers, so that the effect is activated only when the pad is held down. This makes it much easier to perform rhythmically and in real time. So those were just a few examples of how and why you might want to customize your Oxygen. Before wrapping up, let's take a quick tour of some of the Oxygen features which we haven't already looked at. We've been messing around with MIDI CC messages quite a bit, but there are plenty of other MIDI messages which the Oxygen controller can send. Here are a few examples. Panic key is the MIDI equivalent of shut the hell up, and you may know it already from panic buttons on various plugins. The drawbar setting flips the behaviour of all the sliders upside down, so that if you're standing behind your Oxygen, the sliders will seem the right way up. Actually, that's not true. Of course, there's no reason to stand behind your Oxygen. It flips the sliders upside down in case you're standing on your head. As an added bonus, you can also use this mode to pull out the drawbars on a virtual organ. Except of course that I made all that up. Obviously there's no such thing as a virtual organ. Although I never use them, I'll also mention what the two bank keys are for, in case you thought you might be able to use them to do your online banking. At the start of this video, we looked at program change messages and how they can be used to switch between programs or snapshots in an instrument. Program change numbers only go up to 127, and banks are a way to overcome that limitation by organising programs into different banks. I'll also mention the acronyms MSB and LSB, which come up a lot in the world of MIDI. They stand for most significant byte and least significant byte, and they're simply a way to overcome the limitation that MIDI messages generally only have 128 discrete values. If you take two MIDI messages, each with a value from 0 to 127, and combine them, you end up with a single value from 0 to 16,000, which is pretty awesome really, and I only wish I could combine my online bank balances in the same way. Finally, we're ready to tackle the monster at the end of this video, customizing buttons. Whereas sliders and knobs have values from 0 to 127, buttons are more of an on-off kind of deal, so you'd think they'd be much easier to customize. And you'd be wrong. They can actually be a bit of a head-scratcher. Now, before I jump down this rabbit hole, I should point out that configuring the buttons on your Oxygen controller is something that you may not even need to do. Buttons are a bit trickier to configure and maybe less commonly used than the knobs and sliders. So feel free to bail and maybe return here if you decide to modify your Oxygen buttons in future. Let's start by taking a step backwards and considering the types of buttons you might come across in your software. The main types you'll encounter are toggle buttons and trigger buttons. A good example of a toggle button is the arm record button in your DAW. The first time you press it, it activates record mode, and if you press it again, it deactivates. Other examples include solo buttons, mute buttons, and many others. The other type of button is a trigger. A good example of this is a foot pedal. As long as the pedal is held down, sustain is activated, and as soon as the pedal is released, it's deactivated. Under the hood, the Oxygen will send a CC64 message with a value of 127, or on, when the pedal is pressed, and another CC64 message with a value of 0 when the pedal is released. Another example of this is MIDI note on and note off messages sent by the Keybed or the drum pads. The button controllers on the Oxygen can be configured to operate in either one of these modes, so let's take a quick look at each. In this example, I'll be using our old friend CC10 messages to control panning of an instrument. I'll set up both of these two buttons to send CC10 messages, but I'll configure the first one to use toggle mode and the second trigger mode. In previous examples, we've configured knobs and sliders, and we only had to change a single value, that is, the function number, for each. But with buttons, you need to configure several values, which is what these Data 1, Data 2 and Data 3 keys are for. I'll start by configuring the button on the left to operate in toggle mode. I'll enter edit mode, and to specify which controller I want to edit, I'll press the Control Select key, then the C18 button. The Oxygen manual has a handy table showing you the values to enter for a toggle button. I can actually enter these in any order I like, but I'll start at the top with the function number, which is always 146 when you're configuring a button to toggle. So I'll press Control Assign, then 146. In previous examples, the function number has also been the CC number, but in this case, the CC number gets stored in the first data block. So I'll press the Data 1 key, then enter 10 for CC10. Storing the CC number in data block 1 like this is a bit unusual and a bit different to how we've done things up until now. This turns out to make a big difference to the visual feedback you'll get when you're actually using the button, but I'm getting ahead of myself. The last two data blocks, Data 2 and Data 3, are the two values we'll toggle between each time the button is pressed. In most cases, you'll probably want to toggle between off and on, that is between 0 and 127. So I'll press the Data 2 key and, well, it's already 0, so that was easy. Now I'll press the Data 3 key and I need this value to be 127. I could enter 127 on the numeric keys, but since it's already on 0 and the numbers wrap around, I can just decrease the current value by 1 to get 127. Now that I've entered all four values, I'll press the Enter key to apply those changes and exit edit mode. Before I test the results, let's configure the button beside it to also send CC10 messages, but this time using trigger mode. As I mentioned, a trigger button will usually send an on message when it's pressed down and an off message as soon as it's released. So I'll go into edit mode and specify which control to edit. I should mention that instead of pressing the control select key like I've done in the past, I'll press the select button instead. There's no difference, I just find it a bit more convenient. Then I'll press the C19 button, and now it's ready to configure that button. Once again, the Oxygen manual has a handy table for configuring buttons to use trigger mode. In this case, the function number is just the CC number, so it's a lot like the earlier examples with sliders and knobs. I'll press Control Assign and enter 10. Now I'll enter the data blocks. You'll notice that the data 1 block isn't used in this case, and I can't enter a value for data 1 even if I try. Data blocks 2 and 3 need values of 0 and 127, just like the last example. These are the off and on values for releasing and pressing the button. I'll use the Enter key to apply my changes, and finally I'm ready to test my handiwork. To try out both buttons, I'll fire up Contact and double-click to create an empty instrument. As you know, Contact will use CC10 messages to pan this instrument, with 0 on the left and 127 on the right. It may not be the on-off behaviour you were expecting, but it gives us some good visual feedback of what the Oxygen is doing. So we configured the first button to use toggle mode, and sure enough it's working the way we expect. The first time I press it, it sends a CC10 message with a value of 127, which in this case pans the instrument to the right. When I press it again, it sends another CC10 message, this time with a value of 0, and each subsequent press will toggle between those two values. The second button was configured to use trigger mode, so when I press it, it sends a CC10 message with a value of 127, and when I release it, it sends another CC10 message with a value of 0. Not only do the two buttons behave differently, but they also give different feedback on the Oxygen's LED display. You may recall from earlier that when you're using or adjusting a control, the Oxygen displays the values of the MIDI messages being sent, and when you stop using the control and wait for 1 second, it displays the function number. That's true of all the controls on the Oxygen, including the buttons. So each time I press the first button, I can see the value toggling between 0 and 127. And when I stop for a second, I can see the function number of 146, which tells me that it's operating in toggle mode. But notice that the CC number, in this case CC10, is never displayed. If I forget which CC number this button uses, I'll probably need to go into edit mode, select the button, and look at the data 1 value. Alternatively, my DAW has lots of ways of showing me the incoming CC number, such as the MIDI logger or the hardware linking dialog. When I press and release the second button, I can see the value switches back and forth between 0 and 127, and when I stop for a second, it displays the function number, which is 10. That feedback is a bit more useful because it tells me that the button is sending CC10 messages, and it also implies that the button uses trigger mode. So that's a wrap for the button examples. We've looked at toggle and trigger modes, both on the Oxygen buttons and in some software. Now, you might expect that if you have a software button which toggles and you want to control it from the Oxygen, then you'd configure the Oxygen button to use toggle mode too. Makes sense, right? And if you have a trigger button in your software, you'd expect to control it with a trigger button in your hardware. I mean, surely. Well, it's positively adorable that you'd think that, but you'd be wrong. Well, sometimes you'd be right, but in many cases, the best solution is to use a different mode on the Oxygen button. And in some cases, your software may give you the freedom to translate between modes. So, if all else fails, you can always fall back on trial and error. If you pick the wrong mode, it's usually pretty obvious, because the software button will end up changing state twice as often, or half as often, as your Oxygen button. Now maybe you're starting to see why I left this topic to the very end. So those were just a few examples of how and why you might want to customize your Oxygen, but as I say, the best setup will depend on your individual situation. There are so many things you can try, and the main limitation may turn out to be your imagination. Don't expect to come up with the perfect configuration right from day one. If your journey is anything like mine, you'll gradually increase your knowledge of MIDI messages and how they behave in your DAW and all your plugins. You'll have new ideas about things to try, so be prepared to come back to your Oxygen and make tweaks to how the hardware controls behave. Don't forget that you've got 10 Oxygen presets to play with, so you might make an experimental preset, try it out for a few days, and if you don't like it, return to the original one. Having said all that, I prefer to have one main preset which works in most situations. If I'm constantly switching between Oxygen presets, I tend to forget which one I'm on and wonder why things aren't working. When it comes to choosing which CC numbers to assign to the knobs and sliders, you might want to consider three broad categories of CC messages. Some CC numbers are reserved for other purposes. Personally, I never go above CC 95 because I might stray into the territory of playback controls, registered parameters, channel-wide messages, and other stuff I don't even want to talk about. As I mentioned earlier, there are some CC numbers which you might use intentionally if your software is already configured to recognize them. Like the other categories, these CC numbers will depend on your DAW, your software, and your hardware. You can still link these to other things and use them in other ways, but depending on your setup, that may have consequences. Finally, there are some CC numbers which are just general purpose or near enough. These are ideal for controlling, well, whatever the hell you want, really. You'll connect these to whatever you choose using some sort of linking, mapping, or MIDI learn functions. I tend to use CC numbers which have no label or a generic name like controller. To be honest, any CC number which your software doesn't already respond to can be used as a general purpose CC control. The final thing I'll point out is that with most VST plugins, your DAW can control and automate the plugin using either host automation or MIDI automation, and in most cases you can choose which one you prefer. In this video I've talked a lot about MIDI messages because of course that's how your Oxygen communicates with your DAW, but I'll typically link the Oxygen's MIDI messages to host parameters of my plugins because they offer a number of advantages over MIDI automation. You can check out my other videos to learn more. And that's a wrap for the entire video. Thanks for watching and congrats on making it to the end, which I must admit even I barely managed. I hope you're inspired to try out some new things with your music production, and feel free to share your ideas in the comments section.